We stood there, staring at each other. The church door opened, and I heard a very calm voice call out from the darkness, "It's time to come inside. Both of you." Chapter 29. The door was open, but neither of us moved. We were still face to face, waiting for the other to flinch. I saw his eyes flick to my badge just for the thinnest fraction of a moment, and when our eyes met again, I could tell there was a lifetime of hate stored up there. That was the symbol he hated so much. I was every cop that had ever bullied him, made him feel small, fucked with him just for the hell of it. "Simon," the voice from inside the church said, "come inside." Simon didn't want to leave. He wanted to put his hands around my neck and squeeze. But there was something that wouldn't let him do that, and I sensed it was that voice from the darkness. At that point, I knew there wasn't going to be a fight, and Simon knew it too. He snorted at me like I was lucky and walked back inside the church. The other two men followed Simon inside, leaving me alone on the threshold. It was dark inside the church, and all I could see were a lot of silhouettes standing between the pews. Somebody coughed. Feet shuffled on the wooden floor. The voice said, "Officer, come inside, please." I took one last look at the yard full of dead bodies, remembering the last church I'd been in, and stepped inside. It was dark, but I could still see the faces closest to me. Simon was standing in the corner, giving me a smoldering, hateful look. The man who let me use his rifle was standing next to an older woman and two young children. The others stood in groups watching me. "Thank you," I said, not really knowing what else to say. "You people saved my life out there." Simon said something under his breath and turned away. "You're welcome," one of the other men said. It was the same voice I had heard through the doorway. "Come in. We don't have much here, but it's warm and dry, and you look like you've had quite a night." A very distinct change came over the room when he spoke. The others made way for him, and even in the dark I could see that he was their center, their leader. We shook hands. His grip was powerful and confident, and I got a sense from just that handshake why the others looked up to him. He carried himself with natural, unassuming confidence, like one who always seems to be in charge and accepts the responsibility as easily and with as much grace as another man might put on a coat. I decided right away that I liked him. Simon had already made it clear that if it were up to him, I'd be a bleeding piece of hamburger out there in the elms. But this man was not that way. He welcomed me, and because these were his people, they welcomed me too. I looked him over quickly while I shook his hand. He was an older black man, maybe 57 or so, and about 150 pounds. He wore clean blue work pants with a sharp crease, a black belt, and a starched light blue button-down shirt fastened at the neck. His eyes danced with fiery intensity behind fragile gold-rimmed glasses. His boots were brightly polished. I guessed he was in his 60s with a good splash of gray at the temples, but it was hard to be sure because his body was thin and ropey with muscles. "I'm Tiresias Maple," he said. "Thank you, sir. I'm Eddie Hudson." "Call me Tiresias," he said warmly. "Everybody here does." "Are you the minister here, Tiresias?" "No," he said. "No, unfortunately, the Reverend Joshua Jones died earlier this evening." "Oh," I said, and then a long, uncomfortable moment followed. "I'm sorry." "Please, don't be. You had no way of knowing. And besides, we're glad you're here. We've been inside since before nightfall and haven't heard anything about what's going on. The radio and TV have been off the air for a long time now." I looked around at the others in the room. They were watching me expectantly, and I could tell they wanted good news. Better news than I could give them. "It's bad out there," I said, because if I were in their shoes, I'd want to know the truth. "There are fires burning all over the city, and the places that aren't burning are overrun with those zombie things." "What about the army?" somebody asked. "I don't know anything about the army. Maybe they've got troops on the way. I know we could use them. From what I can tell, most of the police officers and firefighters are dead. And I've heard this is happening all along the Gulf Coast, from Mexico to Miami. If that's true, other cities are probably hurting as bad as we are. That'll probably slow down the military response, too. They'll have to divide their resources over a huge area. A woman in blue jeans and a black top asked me, "What about a safe area or something? Ain't somebody coming to get us?" "I'm sorry," I said, "but what you see is what you get. I just came from police headquarters hoping to answer that very question, but it was overrun. If somebody had a plan, it's out the window now. There's no one left to take charge, and I haven't seen another police officer for hours." "So what are we supposed to do?" somebody else asked. "I don't know. Find a way to survive, I guess. From what little I've seen, you people are better off than almost everybody else." I looked around at their faces and tried not to think of the folks at the Lexington Baptist Church. These people didn't need to hear about that. I guess you just hold what you got till something changes. They turned quiet while they took all that in. Tiresias finally broke the silence and said, "It looks like we'll be on our own for a good while still. The Lord helps those who help themselves. So it's time to help ourselves. I'd like everyone to continue fixing the damage and boarding the windows. When that's done, we'll begin the service." The others went off, murmuring to each other about what I'd said. "Officer Hudson," Tiresias said, "you're welcome here. There was another police officer here earlier, an Officer Gibbs. I'm sorry to say he's also passed on." "Gibbs?" I had a classmate at the academy named Gibbs. A big, dumb guy who you couldn't help but love, even though, God help him, he could hardly tell if he was wearing his uniform frontward or backward. "Did you happen to catch his first name?" "No, I'm sorry. He was in pretty bad shape when he came to us." "What does it matter?" Simon said suddenly from the shadows. I hadn't noticed he was still standing there. "One cop's just like another. As long as he's dead, who cares?" He came out of the shadows just enough for me to see his face, his eyes searching for a fight. "Something you want to say to me?" I asked him. "Tiresias, why are you going to let him stay? After what that first cop done to us, how can you let this one stay?" "That's enough, Simon." "He don't care about us." "I said that's enough." Tiresias put a lot of emphasis on that last word, and it worked on Simon. He backed away, but the hate was still smoldering in his eyes. Under different circumstances, a look like that would have earned him a night in the jail, and probably a layover in the hospital, too. But things had changed. Tiresias told Simon to go and light the candles for the service. "From now on," he said, "we worship in the light." Simon slipped away without saying anything else, leaving me with Tiresias. I saw the blue spurt of a dozen matches, and soon the whole inside of the church began to glow with a yellow, flickering light. I could see the others moving around inside, and some were even smiling. God help me, it was the first smile I had seen since before Marcus died, and it filled me with warmth. "We've had the church blacked out since before nightfall," Tiresias said, and pointed to the boards on the windows. "Our thinking was that those persons out there are somehow attracted to light and sound. Anything that might indicate the presence of an uninfected person." I nodded. "You're not worried about the light attracting them now?" I asked. "Actually, I am," he said, taking off his glasses and breathing on them. He took a moment to polish them under his shirt sleeve, a gesture that reminded me more than a little of Ken Stoller. "But I think it's more important to give people the small signs they need that things will get better. These people have been through a lot, and they need something more than just huddling together in the dark." "This is the service you talked about?" "Yes." He slipped his glasses back on. "I was hoping you would join us." "I shouldn't," I said. "Ever since this started, I've been trying to make it back to my family. That's where I want to be." "You're a young man, Officer Hudson. You must have a young family." I nodded and looked away. "I have a son, Andrew. He's 6 months old." "That is young," Tiresias said, and to my surprise he chuckled. "I remember what that was like. I have 2 daughters myself. They're both grown. You must be worried about them." "I am. One's in Dallas, the other in Atlanta. I'm very worried. I've said my prayers for them, though." I had nowhere to go from there, nothing I could say to him. His problems weren't that different from my own, yet I didn't share his confidence. Prayers weren't enough for me. I needed to hold my child to put my mind at ease. "You're welcome to stay," he said at last. "Thank you," I said uncomfortably. He took a moment to glance around the church. The inside was well lit and the pews were filling up. "I take it you're out of ammunition," he said. "I am," I said. He surprised me with that. "How'd you know?" "I saw you holster your weapon earlier. I don't think you would have done something like that if you still had bullets left in your gun." I nodded. "That officer I told you about earlier," he said. "He was badly injured when he came to us. He was only able to fire a few shots before those people out there attacked him. His body is upstairs. Perhaps you'll stay for the service. Afterwards you can take whatever ammunition you can find, and then you can go to your family." I didn't want to, but I realized it would be stupid to say no. He and his people had been good enough to take me in when I needed it most, and now they were giving me ammunition, too. "Excellent," Tiresias said. "I'll start in just a moment." "You? I thought you said you weren't the minister here." "I'm not," he said. "I'm a bricklayer. Been doing it for more than 50 years. But I've been coming to this church for longer than that, and the folks here asked me to lead them in prayer after the Reverend Jones died. I had planned on waiting till morning to do that, but after what's happened I think now is as good a time as any." We shook hands again, and I took a spot next to a pillar behind the last pew. My plan was to leave as soon as I could slip out and try not to be noticed. I figured the fewer questions they asked me, the easier it would be. The place was alive with moving light. It made the place seem warmer, friendlier. People around me chatted with each other and exchanged greetings, and it was almost surreal enough for me to think I had dreamed everything up to that point. Almost. The people milled around like Sunday morning until they saw Tiresias mount the pulpit. Everyone took their seats. That's when I slipped away. I stepped back into the shadows and made for the upstairs room near the front door, where Tiresias said I would find Gibbs's body. I half expected every step to carry me over the edge of a cliff. It was like there was a big coiled snake moving slowly through my gut. I wanted to sit down and rest, to let the sick feeling inside me pass, but I knew I couldn't. I still had miles to go before that could happen. I took the stairs slowly, one at a time, lugging my heavy, mud and blood-stained boots up the steps like I was climbing a gallows, and from somewhere behind me I could hear Tiresias leading the others in prayer. Chapter 30. The upstairs room was really just a storage closet. They kept a few broken chairs and a cheap metal picnic table off in the corner, but the rest of it was empty. Almost empty, anyway. There were 8 corpses along the opposite wall beneath a blue window. The bodies were covered with white tablecloths and tied off with a small-gauge rope. They reminded me of the root balls of trees about to be planted. There wasn't any sign of gore. There were no pools of congealed blood and no foul odors. It was all very clean and decent. The bodies were laid out on the floor, but it had been done with obvious respect. Of course, Tiresias and his people had only been able to do so much to cover up the violence that had brought those bodies to that point. I saw a white hand and wrist, still wearing a watch and wedding ring, sticking out from under the sheet like it was reaching for something. I stopped in my tracks, waiting for the rest of the body to unfold itself and come after me. That didn't happen, though. The body was at rest. Even still, there was something grotesque about the way that hand rested there, palm upwards on the floor, like it wanted something I couldn't give. I got the feeling from that mute gesture that it was reaching back for the life that had once moved it, even if that meant returning to this nightmare world of the necrosis virus. It wanted even that. I moved very slowly as I crossed the rest of the way to the bodies and worked back the sheets, one body at a time, until I found Gibbs's corpse. I pulled the sheet back far enough to uncover his gun belt, but I didn't want to look at his face. It made it easier somehow not to. He had 2 full magazines in his belt pouch, and I took them both. I slapped one in the gun, tucked the other into my belt, and then slid the sheet back over his body. I kept meaning to turn around and go, but it was hard to look away. It was like watching the hands of a clock chase each other around the dial. Nothing ever seems to change, but all the while something precious slips away. I looked out the blue window at the unburied corpses in the parking lot, and I thought about what it all meant. The problem was so big, so incredibly vast. I had a vision of myself standing in the middle of an immense, utterly featureless plain, the horizon impossibly distant in every direction. Wherever I turned, there were miles and miles of nothingness. There was no sound, no taste, no reference of any kind. I was alone, and my questions had no answers. If I could have painted a picture of my personal hell, that featureless plain would have been it. I heard footsteps. They stopped somewhere behind me, and I turned to face them. Simon was standing there, and he was holding a bat. "What do you want?" I asked him. He shrugged, but he made sure I saw the bat. "Is that supposed to scare me? It doesn't, you know. After all, I'm not the one who brought a bat to a gunfight." "You ain't gonna shoot me." "You sound awfully sure of yourself." "Yeah, well, I got good reason to sound sure of myself, because I'm gonna knock the fuck out of you if you take one step closer." My pulse quickened and my body tensed. This was familiar territory for me, the old game of who's got the biggest balls. "What's wrong with you, Simon? Did somebody write you a ticket and hurt your feelings? Come on, fess up. I bet you've got warrants, don't you?" "You think this is funny?" "No, Simon, I don't. I think you're an asshole. That's about as far as I've taken it, and that's about all I care to know. Now why don't you take your dumb ass downstairs before you get yourself hurt?" His eyes narrowed on me, and I knew things were about to get really nasty. When he took a step from me, I drew my gun and pointed it right at his head. If he had been a little faster, he probably could have put the bat upside my head. But as it was, he stopped in his tracks. My finger was twitching on the trigger, ready for him to make a move. Wait for it, wait for it. "Stop it! Both of you! Stop it!" It was Tiresias. He was behind Simon, standing at the top of the stairs. Simon didn't take his eyes off me. My gun didn't move. "Simon," Tiresias said. His voice was softer the second time. But neither one of us moved. Simon was fighting a battle with himself, and I watched it play out on his face. He desperately wanted to wrap that bat around my skull, but at the same time I knew Tiresias had a special power over him. In the end, that power won out, and Simon let the business end of the bat fall to the floor with a thud. Damn, that thing would have hurt. "Simon," Tiresias said gently but very firmly, "go downstairs." Simon didn't say another word. He wrapped his fury up inside him and walked downstairs, leaving me with Tiresias. When he was gone, I said, "I wouldn't have shot him unless he made me." Tiresias didn't say anything to that for a long moment. He took his small gold-rimmed glasses out of his shirt pocket and slipped them on. In his powerful hands they looked like they might crumple. He smiled at me and said, "I'm blind as a man can be without these things." "I didn't start that," I said, pointing at the stairs. "I don't know what his problem is, but I didn't start it." "He doesn't like the police." Was that it? Gosh, I couldn't tell. "His feelings are misplaced, obviously. But tonight has been very hard on him." "Yeah, well, it hasn't exactly been a cakewalk for me either." "No, of course not. It's been hard on all of us. But it's been especially hard on Simon. He lost his mother tonight. She was a good woman and a dear friend of mine." "I'm sorry about that," I said. "But he acts like I'm the one who killed her. I never said a cross word to him before he tried to get me to fight on the porch." "Things are rarely as simple as they ought to be," he said. "We carry so many things around inside us, so much baggage. Sometimes that baggage keeps us from changing when we need to." "That may be," I said, "but it still doesn't answer why he hates me so much." Tiresias paused over that for a moment. Finally he said, "I brought Simon and his mother here as soon as I heard about what was happening. Simon's mother was a nurse. When the first wounded started showing up here, she treated them as best she could. Your friend, Officer Gibbs, was one of those wounded. She worked on him for a long time, but in the end there was nothing she could do for him but let him slip into that coma-like state the infected have. At the time, we still didn't understand what was happening with the people who did that, how they, came back. After he rose up, he attacked her. That's how we lost her. Her body is over there with the others." There was nothing I could say to that. It didn't make Simon any less of an asshole, in my opinion, but at least it gave his hostility a context. We stood there for a moment in silence before he said, "You must be eager to leave." "Yes," I said. "You said you have a 6-month-old son, right?" I nodded. "His name's Andrew." "So young," he said, and whistled through his teeth. "Do you know where you'll meet your family?" "I haven't got a clue. We didn't have time to make plans. I don't know how I'm going to find them. I've already been to my house once tonight, but they weren't there. Her car wasn't in the garage, so I guess they could be anywhere. I just don't know." "And there's no place you can think of where she might have gone? Your church, maybe, or another family's house?" "No, it's just us." "So where will you start looking for them?" "You know, I don't have the foggiest idea. They could be anywhere. I suppose I'll go back to the house and start from there. Maybe they left me a note or something. Last time I was there, I didn't really take the time to look around. First thing I need to do, though, is find a car." He cracked a small smile. "I don't think you'll have a problem with that. You have friends, after all." "I appreciate your optimism, but I think I've been kicked around a little too much tonight to share it. From where I'm standing, it looks like I'm going at it alone from here on out." "That bothers you?" It wasn't a question, just a dry observation. "Don't you think that's enough?" "Absolutely. Being alone is a terrifying thing. It's enough to scare any man, even one who is as equipped to take care of himself as a police officer." I nodded uncomfortably. All I wanted to do was get out of there, find a car, and make my way back to my house. I happened to glance back at the bodies, and I noticed the hand still sticking out from underneath the sheet. Tiresias had said Gibbs was injured not too far away, and I figured that meant his patrol car had to be close by, too. "What about Gibbs's car?" I asked him. "Did you see where he left it?" "Yes, but I'm afraid it won't be much use to you. When I found him, he was climbing out of a culvert a few blocks over. His car was at the bottom of that culvert." "Eddie," he said, and it startled me a little to hear him use my first name. "Do you mind if I ask you a personal question?" "Here it comes. Leave the sermon early? The preacher grabs you by the ear later." "No," I said warily. "Shoot." "I've been thinking about everything I've seen tonight. Sitting in this church, there's not much else to do. Just sit and pray and think." He walked over to the blue window and looked out, then ran his finger lightly across the sheet, respectfully, mindful of the heavy burden under it. "So many people have died tonight," he said. "So many friends and strangers and people I'll never know. It boggles the mind. What I want to know, Eddie, is if you've tried to put some kind of value on it. Have you thought about what it means?" His back was to me, which was good, for had he been looking at me, he would have seen my mouth fall open. The man was in my head, saying the words that I had said to myself in the exact same spot where he was now standing. I was dumbfounded. I thought about telling him about my vision, about the featureless land where answers had ceased to exist, and that I had named my personal hell, but I held back. Somehow I just couldn't put that in words. Instead, I simply said, "That's not an easy question to answer." "No, it's not. But it occurs to me that those of us who live through tonight are going to have to try and put some kind of meaning to it. Those of us who live are going to be defined by this, changed by it in ways we can't even begin to imagine right now. You will have to raise a child in this new world. You have to put your thoughts in order. If not now, soon." I thought about it, about putting my thoughts in order, about what I might tell Andrew about this night, many years from now, when he happened to ask what it was like, and it shamed me that I had nothing to say. There was a great big hole where the answer should have been. All I could think of was that I wasn't ready for something like this to happen, that it wasn't fair. I had no idea how to put it all in one little neat package. The world had flipped upside down and left me hanging. There was absolutely nothing in my experience to prepare me for the new world Tiresias was talking about. Now that I was asked to articulate what I was feeling, all I could do was stammer around the issue. "I don't have an answer for you, Tiresias. I just don't know what I think. I guess my gut reaction is that it just isn't fair. I saw one of the officers I used to work with die tonight. I watched him as he slipped into one of those things. He was a husband and a father just like me. He loved his wife and his new baby as much as I love my family, and in the end he couldn't even remember their names. He told me he didn't even remember what love felt like. That's the worst part of all this, I think. That's what really scares me about those things. It scares me that I could lose my mind that way, die without any understanding. It makes me wonder what we did to deserve that kind of cruelty." He nodded silently. I got ready for him to harangue me about God and maybe give me the bit about Job and how we're just not equipped to understand the ways of God. But to my relief, he simply turned and stared out the window. When he turned back to me, he said, "For me, tonight has been about salvation. For you, it seems to be about justice. We couch our thoughts in different language, but I think we're not too far off from each other. Justice and salvation, after all, are two sides of the same coin as far as God is concerned." He turned and looked out the window again, and it seemed his mind was focusing on something that only he could see. "I was standing here when I saw you come out of the trees," he said. "I'm lucky you were there." He tapped on the window thoughtfully. "You know,
It occurs to me that the hardest part of the days and weeks and years to come is not going to be putting the conveniences of our old world back together, but re-establishing the bridges between those who survive. There's a lot of work ahead of us, a lot of community building.
How do you mean?
I used to come home and watch the news. I would sit on my couch and stare at the TV and shake my head, wondering why we never seemed to get anywhere. Everything was the same. Always the same thing. Night after night, year after year. I have the terrible feeling that what we're seeing out there is the failure of our community, that all of that death is simply the manifestation of our lack of place, a sense of who we are and what we mean to each other. Our cities have turned into a nightmare landscape of violence and apathy, where personal responsibility is optional, and our affection for one another withered to a ghost of its former self. I know as a police officer you have seen what I'm talking about. Perhaps you're better equipped than most to understand what I mean.
People have always been that way, though, haven't they?
None of this is new, like you say.
Isn't it man's nature to be self-serving and cruel? Brotherly love only goes so far as it's mutually advantageous.
Nothing is impossible, Eddie.
He said it with honest conviction, not irony.
People can change. Worlds can change. Christ's death destroyed a community, but his resurrection created a new world. Maybe that's our task. Have you thought about that? Have you considered that maybe this is the birth of a new world? That what happens next is a golden opportunity to change the nature of man in a fundamental way?
Those are brave words, Tiresias.
New parents can't afford to be anything but brave, Eddie.
You're right about that. I stood there for a moment, ready to leave, but almost not wanting to.
Do you have any idea where you'll go from here?
Not a clue, I said.
You said you needed a car, right?
Yeah. I figured I would head east from here and try to find one in a traffic jam somewhere. That's worked for me once already.
I think I can help you,
he said.
Did you happen to see a maroon Pontiac in the parking lot when you were fighting on the porch?
I shook my head. Then he did something that completely floored me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of car keys and put them in my hand. I stared at the keys and then at him. I can't take your car, Tiresias.
Yes, you can. I don't need it. The people you met downstairs, they are my family. That's where I'm going to start building my bridges. Now it's your turn to go home. Start building the bridges from your end. Hopefully I'll meet you in the middle someplace.
His kindness shocked me like a punch in the gut. Had our positions been reversed, I'm sure I wouldn't have done the same thing for him, and it made me doubt if what he said was true. How many more people like me were out there? How many others had as far to go as I did? His dream of building a world full of bridges was still a long way off. I knew that. But maybe it wasn't impossible either. Maybe it could be more than a pipe dream. With the keys in my hand, I walked down the stairs and out the front door of the church. I walked through a haze the whole way. If the others watched me leave, I wasn't aware of it. I wasn't even aware of the cold night air against my face as I walked across the parking lot, found Tiresias's car, and climbed inside. Chapter 31. If there's any truth to that old saying that cleanliness is next to godliness, then Tiresias's '88 Pontiac Grand Am was the window to a godly soul. I have been inside thousands of cars as a policeman, but never have I seen a car with 120,000 miles on it that looked as good as his did. There wasn't a speck of dust anywhere, no trash,
No smell of stale smoke. No soda stains on the seats. It was perfectly clean. I rubbed an appreciative hand across the dashboard and put it in gear. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as I pulled out of the parking lot. I tried hard not to run over any bodies. I drove Tiresias's car through the cracked and broken streets of the east side, and for the longest time I saw nothing but blacked-out houses and moldering urban decay. But even as I drove through those ruins, I felt my mind coming together, clearing. I still had a deep sense of urgency, a longing to get home that overpowered everything else I was feeling. But it was tempered now with the realization that things could make sense, that the world didn't have to stay upside down. It was only a sense. Still, the answer, eluded me. But I took comfort in the hope of an answer, for before, even that had seemed impossibly distant. Now that I was moving, distance didn't seem like such a massive obstacle. I worked my way steadily northward from the church, and when I finally left the confines of the east side and turned onto a dark farm-to-market road that made a long loop all the way across the northern edge of San Antonio, I almost felt like I was floating. Feeling better than I had all night, I took the robbery detective's phone from my belt and tried April's cell again. The first time I just got static, but the second time it started to ring. I almost sensed that it would. April picked up.
"Eddie,"
she said, her voice frayed around the edges.
"Eddie, is that you?"
"It's me, sweetie. I'm coming home. I'm on the way there."
"Oh, thank God. Me too."
"Is Andrew okay?" I asked.
"He's crying. I'm taking him home to get the formula. He hasn't eaten all night."
"Okay," I said. "I'll meet you there."
"Eddie, don't hang up. Please."
"I'm not," I said, but we were speaking across oceans of static. "April, are you there? April." More static, and then a moment of silence. I almost spoke her name again, but just then I heard her scream. It was a horrible, crippling sound.
"April,"
I said, my own voice cracking.
"April."
There was nothing left of the connection. I tried calling again and again and got nothing but static. Panicked, I stomped on the gas and ran at top speed all the way back to my subdivision. Because I was coming in from the east, I took the Blackberry Lane entrance. I drove across the front lawn of somebody's house to get around a knot of traffic, and then I was rolling again. From Blackberry, I turned onto Rockgate and started up towards my house. Once Rockgate crosses Border Beacon, it curves sharply to the right and starts a gradual uphill slope that continues all the way across the subdivision. Just around the curve, Rockgate comes together with Starlight Crest, meeting at a 45-degree angle. My plan was to go past Starlight Crest, turn onto Lullaby, and take that back to my house. But as I got into the intersection, I saw a black SUV coming from my left. At the same time, I saw a car with only one headlight coming towards the intersection on the other side of Rockgate. It was swerving drunkenly from one side of the street to the other, completely out of control. I stared at them both in turn, my mouth in the shape of an O. It had been hours since I'd seen another moving vehicle, and here were two of them, and they were on a collision course. The black SUV and the car entered the intersection at the same time, and I cringed in anticipation of the impact. There was an aching crunch of metal and breaking glass. The back end of the SUV popped up and slid sideways, its momentum sending it into a 150-foot-long neutral skid. Still going sideways, it bounced over a curb and into a lawn, where it crashed into a tree. The car spun counterclockwise and ended up sideways in the intersection, its front end crumpled beyond recognition. When I got to the intersection, there was a fine yellow cloud of smoke and dust in the air, and the car's horn was blaring continuously. The SUV was nose down at the base of a tree, its back right tire still spinning uselessly in the air. In the commotion, it took me a second to register that the SUV was a Nissan Xterra. I thought, April! "April!" I yelled, and then,
Yelling her name over and over again, I jumped out of Tiresias's car and ran for her. Chapter 32. I ran toward the car, yelling April's name at the top of my lungs. As I came up on the back end of the Xterra, I heard the driver's side door open. "April," I said. I turned the corner to the driver's side and saw April standing there with my Springfield .45 in both hands, pointing it right at my face. She fired as soon as she saw me, and I heard the bullet whistle past my ear. I made a startled noise and jumped back behind the tailgate. "April! What the hell? Get away from my baby!" she said, shrieking it at the top of her lungs. "April," I said. "April, it's me." "Get away! Leave us alone!" "April, sweetie, it's me, it's Eddie." There was a really long pause before she finally said, "Eddie? It's me, April. It's me." I didn't move from behind the car. "April, put the gun down, okay?" "How do I know you're not one of those things?" "Oh, for the love of Christ," I said under my breath. "You know it's me because we're having this freaking conversation." "Don't yell at me." "I'm not yelling." But then I caught myself and made my voice go as small and as non-threatening as I could. "I'm not yelling, April. I know you're scared. I'm scared too, okay? But it's me, Eddie. Now please, April, put the gun down and let me show you." I waited for her to speak. I could picture her there, her lips trembling, holding that huge gun in her shaking hands and fighting against her fear and every motherly instinct in her body to believe what she was hearing. It didn't matter that she had almost killed me. The fact that she was willing to face down anything to protect our child made me so proud of her that I could have forgiven her anything at that moment. "April," I said quietly. From inside the car, I could hear Andrew starting to cry. "April? Eddie?" "It's me." I stood up slowly and inched over toward her side of the car. "April, I'm going to step around the corner now, okay?" "Okay." Very slowly I put my hand around the corner and waved it. When she didn't fire, I went farther until I was completely around the corner facing her. She stood there, shivering, tears running down her beautiful face, and so overcome by her emotion her whole mouth quivered with it. I was looking straight down the barrel of the Springfield. She looked me over, and her face gave way to recognition, and then to shock at the sight of me. I didn't realize how bad I looked until just then. I was covered in mud and grime and God knows what else. I barely looked like her husband. No wonder she tried to shoot me. Finally she said, "Oh, my God," and let the gun fall to her side. "Are you guys okay?" She covered her mouth with her hand, her body racking with convulsive sobs. "Eddie. Oh, my God, Eddie." I reached out to pull her into my arms, but she put up her hand to stop me. Her eyes went huge, looking at something over my shoulder. I turned and saw a woman climbing out of the car that had just hit her SUV. She had a nasty-looking wound on her arm that had to be from a bite. It was so torn up. She stumbled sideways into the street, confused by the blaring horn and the dust in the air. But when she saw us, all the confusion vanished. Her lips pulled back, and she came for us with all the speed she could muster. "Get Andrew," I told April. "We'll put him in my car." April jumped into the back seat and worked the buckles on Andrew's car seat. While she was doing that, I was scanning the area, looking for trouble. I found it in the next yard. 2 zombies were lumbering into the street, headed our way, and a third was coming up fast behind them. I fired twice, and both zombies went down. While April kept wrestling with Andrew's straps, I waited on the woman who had hit April's car. When she was in range, I dropped her with my best shot of the night. "What's taking so long?" "It's the straps," April said. "Something's stuck. The buckle won't come loose." "Hurry, April," I said. The car horn and the gunshots were like a beacon for the zombies. I saw 3 more come out of a house across the street, and I could see more moving our way from down the street. "You got it yet?" I yelled.
"No."
Her hands were all over the car seat trying to get Andrew out. Andrew picked up on the emotion and started screaming. Not hurt, but very scared. I shot the 3 zombies that had just entered the street, and then jumped into the Xterra to help April. She was right. The straps were stuck somehow, and the buckle wouldn't give. Out of the back window of the Xterra, I could see more and more zombies. They were coming out of houses, between houses, out of everywhere at once. A large, long group of 20 or so got between us and Tiresias's car, and I knew we were out of time. "Here," I said, pushing April aside. "Let me get in there." I put my foot on the seat next to Andrew's car seat and used all my weight to pull the strap toward me. When it finally let go, I went tumbling backwards into the front seat. "Get him out," I said. But she was already doing that. She pulled him out of the seat, and then we were standing in the front yard of a stranger's house, surrounded by a growing crowd. I kept my breathing slow and under control. There was no way we could force our way through the crowd with Andrew in tow, and the only option was to stand and fight. A woman in a white floral nightgown was the closest. Most of her stomach had been eaten, and she walked hunched over so that the strands of skin that had once been her face dangled over her shoes like jelly fishing lures. I closed the distance between us and put a bullet in her head. After that I burned through my 2 magazines in a hurry. Before I knew it, I had piles of corpses stacked up around the Xterra. But for all my shooting, I didn't make a dent in their numbers. I was facing April and Andrew when I fired my last bullet at a man who was wearing nothing but a ripped T-shirt. Poor Andrew's whole body flinched with the gun's report. "We've got to get to my car," I said. "Where's the gun you had?"
"In the car."
I ran to the Xterra and rummaged through the front seat, but I couldn't find it. "Where?" I asked.
"It's there," she
said. I looked again, pushing Andrew's blanket and toys out of the way, until I finally spotted it on the passenger side floorboard. I got control of the Springfield just in time to fire at a zombie a few feet from the car. When the bullet hit his forehead, big chunks of the top of his head splattered onto the pebbled walkway behind him. The Springfield was a serious weapon. It made the Glock look like a pellet gun in comparison. One shot was enough to make the zombie's head and feet trade places and send him tumbling into the grass behind him.
"Eddie!"
I jumped out of the Xterra, trying to find April in the crowd I had let get too close. 3 zombies had cornered her near a line of bushes, and she was slapping at them with her free hand, blocking Andrew from them with her body.
"Eddie!"
They towered over her, and as she turned to get away, one of the zombies managed to pull Andrew from her arms.
"Eddie!"
she said, screaming it. The zombie who had grabbed Andrew was an older woman in the process of losing her bathrobe. I hit her at a run, grabbing Andrew and yanking him away from her as I made contact. The woman fell to the ground, but not before she swiped at Andrew's face. She missed, hitting him in the arm instead and leaving a thin 2-inch-long cut on his bicep. He yelped in pain. "Fucking bitch," I said, and before she could get up, I kicked her in the face with everything I had. When I looked up, April was nowhere to be seen, but there were zombies everywhere. I backed up, and once I had a free lane through the crowd, ran for the street. From there I could see April dodging for her life. I yelled out to her, but I don't think she heard. The Springfield had 5 shots left, and I used them all. I shot my way through part of the crowd, and ended up around the corner from where the accident had happened. I still had Andrew in my arms, and he was holding on to my neck, screaming. The crowd followed us, surrounding us again. The only weapon I had left was my baton, and I snapped it open with my free hand. "You and me, buddy," I said to Andrew, and kissed his cheek. "You and me." I tensed up, ready for the fight. I knew that I was looking at the end, and I promised myself there'd be no escape without my son. I'd die before I gave him up, and if they took him from me anyway, then they could have me too. "I love you, buddy," I said, and dug in. That's when I heard a nasty series of thuds and the whine of a small-bore motor struggling to accelerate. I watched in stunned silence as headlights momentarily backlit the crowd. A few turned to face the light, only to be mowed down by the front end of Tiresias's car. The car careened through the crowd and went sideways into a skid that stopped barely 10 feet from me. April threw the door open. "Hurry," she said, and I did. I pushed my way into the car, and we were rolling before I could even close the door. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Yeah, you?" She nodded. "How is he?" "One of them scratched him," I said. "Oh my God, where?" I showed her. "Do you think?" "I don't know," I said. Chapter 33. Looking out the passenger window, I watched the houses of our neighborhood slip past like snapshots of a lost world. Some of the neighborhood seemed so peaceful, so normal, it was hard to believe anything had happened. Other parts were less so. A white-haired woman in a green dress was on her knees at the corner of our street, eating someone's arm. I closed my eyes. Wrecked cars were everywhere. Wrecked people, too. Here and there they drifted into the street, watching us drive by with dead, empty eyes. Andrew was in my arms, and I could smell him. Nothing intoxicates like the smell of your own baby. I pulled him close. His crying had given way to sobs, and then to an unhappy silence. He was cold, wet, and hungry, but he sat still in my lap. The cut on his arm filled the car with an uneasy silence. April and I both looked at it, and we both worried. I remembered Ken Stoller and Dr. Stiles both saying that the necrosis virus was transmitted through bodily fluids, or at least they believed that was how it was transmitted, and I prayed that none had passed to Andrew. Maybe a scratch could just be a scratch. "Do you think it'll be okay?" April asked as she pulled up to the front of our house. "I hope so," I said, but I didn't know. There were zombies milling our way from both ends of the block. "We need to hurry, April. Let's get him inside and clean it, then we'll go somewhere." "Where?" "I don't know. Somewhere out of the city." We hurried inside. April stopped right inside the front door and cupped a hand over her mouth. "Oh, my God." "I know," I said, looking at the dead bodies I'd left spread throughout our home. "I was here earlier. Don't worry, I'll clean it." April went to work on Andrew. She cleaned the wound 6 times at least, scrubbing it even though he screamed in protest, then changed him and got a couple of extra clothes for him to wear. Meanwhile, I loaded up the formula, bottles, and bottled water. While we worked, April told me about her night. "Right after you called that first time," she said, "I went around locking doors and windows. I had your guns with me, and Andrew and I were sitting on the couch. And then Mr. Cowper from across the street started banging on the door. I know I shouldn't have, but he looked normal, and he was looking right at me, through the window. I opened the door, and oh my God." "What?" "Part of his stomach was gone," she said, and tried to choke the tears back. She tried to tell me again, but couldn't. All she could do was bend down and kiss Andrew on his forehead and let the tears fall on his face. "What did you do?" I asked. It took her a moment, but she stood up straight, composed herself, and said, "I shot him." Our eyes met, and I loved her more at that moment than ever before. She was strong. She was brave. She was beautiful in her contradictions, so gentle and loving with our child, so fiercely unrepentant in protecting him. "Where did you guys go?" "We went to Franklin Street after that. You know those new apartments they're building? We parked back there, up along the tree line. I listened to the radio until the stations went off the air. And then, after you called the second time, I kept trying to call you back. It must have taken 2 hours to get through." I nodded. "Is he ready to go?" "Yeah." "Okay," I said. "Let's go see if it's safe. I don't have any more bullets, so we'll have to be quick." She looked confused. "You're not going to take the shotgun?" "You have it?" I asked. "It's right there." She pointed to the couch. The shotgun was right there, between the pillows. "Outstanding," I said. I grabbed it, broke open the breech and checked the shells, and then we were off, rolling away from the curb before any of the zombies that had seen us drive up were close enough to be a threat.
"Where do you want to go?"
she asked. "Out of the city," I said. "Somewhere where it can be just us." She knew the perfect place. She didn't tell me where, but she didn't have to. I could tell as we entered the hill country we were headed for the Round Top Bed and Breakfast, where the two of us had spent our first night as husband and wife. The place was empty. It was a small German-style frontier two-story with a view of miles and miles of cedar and oak trees. We found a room with a southern exposure, changed Andrew's diaper again, and put him down to sleep. We watched him drift off to sleep and kept watching him for a long time after that. Later, we stood arm in arm, staring out the windows that were painted by distant, wind-whipped fires, and watched the city burn. When morning came, a shimmering blood-red cloud loomed over the skyline like a brooding eye.
"Don't go back out there,"
she said, looking up at me with eyes as deep as the sea.
"Please?"
"I'm not going anywhere," I said, and squeezed her close. Chapter 34. 6 weeks later, I was back in a police car, looking down on a winding ribbon of road leading up the hillside to where I was working an overtime job. Road crews had been working around the clock to clean up the debris from that night, and the ones I had been hired to protect were clearing abandoned cars off the roadway, using bulldozers to push them onto transports that hauled them away to some place. The bulldozers were silent now, and the road crews were enjoying a late morning break. I got out of the car and sat on the hood so I could see everything going on below me. A giant buzzard found a roost on top of a light pole not far away. It was one of those glorious winter mornings where everything seems touched by perfection. The sky was a vaulted ceiling of absolute blue. There were no clouds. From one horizon to the other there was nothing to disturb the velvet of its touch. The earth was bathed in a blue so startlingly cold and rich and immaculately clean that when I removed my sunglasses and felt the dry breeze of morning on my skin, I realized I was whole for the first time in a very long while. There had been a housekeeping in my soul, and I felt like I was living the first well day after a very long sickness. I could breathe again. I watched the buzzard spread his massive black wings and hold them open so the sun could warm his body. "Me too," I whispered. The weeks following the outbreak were the hardest I've ever known. None of the days compared to the frantic rush and desperate searching of that first night, but they were hard nonetheless. It was the endless readiness, the constant tension and expectation that something bad was about to happen. It didn't take long for exhaustion to set in, and when you passed people in the street or sat next to them at roll call briefings, you could see that beaten-down look in their eyes. April begged me not to go back to work. She said we could go up into the mountains and disappear. The military had succeeded in containing the outbreak to the Gulf Coast states, she said. No one would ever need to see us again if we went to the mountains of Montana. She said the city was no place to trust with a child. I think the thing that finally convinced her I should go back to work was that there were no reports of rioting. It was an environment ripe for explosion, and yet not one person put a match to the fuse. The outbreak had left a weird sort of calm in its wake. April saw that calm, and a glimmer of hope returned to her mind. It helped, too, that Andrew made a full recovery. Nothing remained of that night for him but a faint little scar. Our worries that he might be infected never amounted to more than sleepless nights. In the end, she let me go back. On my way to work that morning, I stopped and bought the local paper. It was the first issue since the outbreak, and I had been eager to dive into it. I was hungry for information, real information, not the stuff we had been living on from the word-of-mouth grapevine, and I skimmed the paper ravenously. Most of what it said was a repeat of what I had already heard in briefings and from other people, but there were still some statistics there that I hadn't heard. San Antonio had been a city of 1,200,000 people before that night, and now the best estimates put the population somewhere around 300,000. More than 3/4 of the city had died, and my department got hit hard. We went into the outbreak with just over 2,200 officers, and now there were less than 200 of us left. The highest-ranking officer to make it through the outbreak was a lieutenant from Fiscal Services, and the only reason he made it through was because he was out on a fishing boat in Canyon Lake with his 2 teenage sons. When he got back, he found himself breveted to chief. After the fires were put out, the long, unbelievably complex task of putting the world back on its rails began. There were official meetings held in City Hall and unofficial street meetings held in churches, and out in the front lawns of people's homes. And slowly, the rubble started to clear. People were organized. A census was taken. Power was turned on. All the pieces of the puzzle were turned around and studied, and gradually a new picture began to emerge. There was a massive, unspoken tide of emotion swelling up in everyone, a belief that this time around we could do it right. But while everyone believed we could make it better than it had been, not everyone agreed on how that should be done. The most vocal voice of them all was Ken Stoller. Ken had lived through the night, and in the weeks following the outbreak he had become a staunch advocate for the infected. He had an article in the paper laying out his plan for containing the zombies, studying the necrosis virus, and finding a cure. His driving belief was that we, the uninfected, were obliged to save the infected from themselves. He even founded an organization to further that agenda. He called it People for the Ethical Treatment of Zombies, or PETS. Early on, his organization scored a major victory and got a court order prohibiting the military and the police from shooting the infected, unless it was in self-defense or defense of a third party. It was a major headache for me and my fellow officers, and I'd be lying if I said we obeyed the injunction completely. Things happen in the fog of war, especially in strange wars. I didn't need to read Ken's article to know what it said. I'd heard it all firsthand while I was working security at one of the numerous public meetings following the outbreak. Ken delivered his speech to an angry crowd, and I had to escort him off the stage. When I got him to safety, he turned to me and said, "Thanks, Eddie." He held out his hand. "No hard feelings?" I punched him in the nose. "That's for stealing my truck, you asshole," I said, and left him sitting on his butt, staring up at me like a pouting child. I closed my eyes and then slowly opened them. The city skyline was visible off in the distance, and my thoughts wandered back to Tiresias. He was out there somewhere, alive no doubt, and still waiting for me to make the connections, to build the bridges he had first extended to me. I was a long way from that still, but I could feel the changes brewing inside of me. I read on, going from one article to another, reading about adventures that weren't much different from my own. But I didn't get the enjoyment from the paper that I thought I was going to get. In the end, I gently folded it up and tossed it back into the car. I didn't feel like reading any more. There was no sense in stirring everything up again, I thought. And besides, it's hard to read the paper when so many of your friends are dead. But then I saw them. April and Andrew were coming up the road toward the first security gate. I radioed down and told the policeman there to let her through. Suddenly all the hard feelings washed away, and as I watched them drive up the hill, I felt good again. April opened the car doors and got Andrew out. She pointed me out to him and tried to get him to wave to Daddy. I didn't get a wave, but his eyes lit up. I walked toward them, and in that moment my part of the world made sense. Andrew smiled at me,
and I realized that the answer to everything, the one landmark on the featureless plain that was my private hell, was the smile on my baby's face.